Joining me now are two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and Mia Rabson is the Parliamentary and National Reporter for the Canadian Press. Both of you, thanks for joining us. Let's start with what everyone's been speaking about so much this week, and that is the Trudeau government's response to the new variant of the coronavirus. I'll start with you. Mia, you've been following this pandemic for 2 years. You've been filing on this pandemic. What do you make of the latest developments?
The latest developments, to quote Dr. Theresa Tam, the country's top doctor, it's very complicated. We have a new variant that we don't know a lot about. We have a government that is trying to respond as quickly as they can so they can avoid some of the criticism they've had in the past about being slow out of the blocks when there's new variants that are coming. We don't know whether this variant is going to respond to vaccines, and the government decided that they were going to ban travel from some countries, and they're going to start testing people coming back, except from the US, and except if you're fully vaccinated, you can go home. There are so many different scenarios that are so complicated. Like, you'd need a flow chart that's 7 pages long in order to understand it. And they sort of admit that today. They know that it's complicated. They know they haven't done a great job communicating it, and it's a big problem for them right now.
Bob, is there a problem with the rushed response? Because a lot of people were praising them for responding quickly, unlike with previous variants, but then they also pay the price of not having everything rolled out once they've already announced it.
Well, look, there is definitely a lot of confusion here, and this is upsetting people's Christmas plans for sure. But it's hard to fault the government for clarity on this issue. We only learned last Friday about this new, very potentially dangerous variant, and governments around the world are responding as quickly as they can, and there is a lot of confusion for sure, but better that they respond with some kind of measures to try to prevent the spread of this potentially dangerous variant. And it is going to be confusing, though. If you come in from outside the country, you're going to have to come in with a PCR test at least 72 hours. When you land at a Canadian airport, God knows of the lineups, but you're going to have to get a PCR test, and you're going to have to go home and then Zoom with a nurse and then send it by registered mail. And you'll probably be at home quarantined for 3 days or so before you get the results back. So that is definitely a bummer for everybody, except from the United States.
Except if
you'll be able to go into the United States or come back from the United States, you're not going to have that problem. And one of the reasons for that, Martin, is I think it would just jam up the lineups at the Canada-U.S. border, would make it impossible for anybody to do that.
Okay, and we will follow this. We follow this ongoing and developing story. I want to talk about another surprise politically, a development this week. I think we were all caught off guard when Erin O'Toole's Conservatives proposed and unanimously passed and fast-tracked and passed the government's legislation banning conversion therapy. It was heralded, obviously, as a welcome development for human rights, but it was also a pretty successful political move. It's being called that by Mr. O'Toole. What do you make of it, Bob?
Well, look, this was a good week for Erin O'Toole. He hasn't had many of those since the House came back with some of the social conservatives and the anti-vaxxers, but they were very successful in making the point to people in caucus on Wednesday, look, you've all had an opportunity to debate this legislation and to vote on it in the last Parliament. This is not doing us any good by doing this. Let's just let the bill pass and go off to the Senate. And surprisingly, everybody agreed to that, much to Mr. O'Toole's relief, because the Conservative Party has been hurt very, very, very badly by the actions of Conservative MPs who seem to be taking the side of anti-vaxxers in this whole controversy.
Mia, does this mean that Mr. O'Toole has now discovered or implemented or imposed a new discipline and a new political savvy in his ranks? And the other question that begs is whether that will still apply to the Conservative senators. Because as we remember, Denise Batters has still not been expelled from the Conservative Senate caucus. Are they going to be renegades on this issue?
The Senate, of course, is a big question mark because we haven't seen what they're going to do with it. And they certainly made problems for this legislation in the spring when it was in front of Parliament the first time. What Erin O'Toole did this week is prove to himself, to his caucus, and to Canadians that he actually is the leader of the party. He made a decision. He managed to convince his MPs to follow that decision, and they did. It took the Liberals completely off guard. They were not expecting this. Some of them were surprised, many of them pleasantly surprised. It was sort of this one moment, given how polarized and the sharp partisanship we've seen on Parliament Hill in many, many years. It was one of those moments where partisanship sort of was put aside for the moment, and you actually did see people working together, which just doesn't happen very often. So that alone was surprising. But for sure, Mr. Otooles has had big questions about whether he had control over parts of his caucus, whether they would listen to him and follow his lead. This week, he proved they did.
Okay. Bob, I want to ask you, and this is a story that takes a lot of recapping, but in the last days of the previous Parliament, they were marked by a standoff. Parliament had ordered the production of documents from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Those documents were regarding the firing of 2 Chinese scientists from the high-security National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. Government refused, saying the documents were sensitive, and that the firing, and they recognized that the firing of those 2 scientists was for security reasons. So it was a standoff. The other parties didn't accept the government's argument, and in fact, we saw the head of the Canada Public Health Agency dragged before the Speaker and reproached for having violated an order of Parliament. It's come back. Where are things now? The Liberals are now proposing another solution.
Well, the Liberals have offered a compromise, one that they had not been willing to do. In fact, when the House came back and the opposition wanted to restore the order of demanding these documents, the government House leader, Mark Holland, said, no, you had to start the whole process over, which was the delaying tactic. It would take months for this to take place. They realized that probably the Speaker was not going to side with them. And they, Thursday afternoon, Mr. Holland came up with a compromise, which is that they'll set up a special committee of members with a member from each of the parties, the Liberals, NDP, Conservatives, and Bloc Québécois. They would get the redacted, unredacted documents and be able to look at these documents involving the firing of these scientists and the transfer of very serious deadly viruses to Wuhan Virology Institute in Wuhan. But if there was a dispute about what should be released public, that would be decided by a panel of 3 former senior judges. So this, to me, is a compromise that probably will be accepted by the opposition parties. It means that that Parliament is supreme. Parliament will get to see these documents, and they will be judicious in deciding which can be released to the public. But the government won't be able to avoid, if there was embarrassing information about how the government has handled that, they are not going to be able to claim that's national security. Yeah. But if there was, the Americans have provided human source intelligence on what may have gone on, that clearly would not be released to the public. So, I mean, and this was something that was proposed in 2010 when there was an impasse over producing documents in the case of Afghan detainees, which makes it all the more palatable. We can't leave, Mia, without talking about Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who has announced this week that the government's putting off by 3 months releasing its federal plan on GHG emissions. This was required to be made public by the end of this year. What's going on, Mia?
Essentially, the election is going on. It interrupted again this plan. The new net zero legislation that they passed in the spring, it requires them to come up with a plan and produce a plan publicly for meeting the new targets for 2030. And they're supposed to do it by the end of December, but the legislation did give them an out that they could ask for another 3 months. He's asking for another 3 months. He's saying he's doing it because they want to consult. They want some written submissions from Indigenous leadership, from provinces, territories, some other experts. But ultimately, they just didn't have the time to pull this together that they wanted to, and they want to make sure that they sort of have more people on board with it before they put it down on paper. So we will finally have our greenhouse gas plan, the concrete one, in March? March 29th is the end of it. I mean, we do know most of what's going to be in there already, all of the stuff from the election. The question is, of course, how many emissions we might cut from some of those things and how some of them will be implemented. Those are the big question marks. All right. Both of you, a very busy first week and a half of Parliament, and it's all coming home to roost now. Thanks for your time, and thanks for going over all these subjects. Thank you. Thank you.